The American Civil War is considered to be one of the most internally destructive wars within the United States of America. A young country at the time, America was caught divided between the northern and southern states. While the South remained predominantly rural, with its focus on agriculture, the North thrived industrially. Such routes opened ground for differing governmental, social, and economic opinions. Eventually, such conflicts would erupt into a disastrous fight raging for 5 long years. Of the many differences that had occurred between the northern and southern states, none was as great as that as slavery was. It was a major question of ethics. While some people condoned it, others acknowledged that it was morally unacceptable. Interestingly enough, as more states were admitted to the Union, its slavery status was also recorded as free or slave states. The election of 1860 would heavily revolve around this debate, as its impact to the United States would be that of a deciding factor in whether the federal government would support it or not. The upcoming presidential candidacy of 1860 was divided between 4 groups: the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Constitutional Union. Opposing slavery and desiring its abolishment, the Republicans elected Abraham Lincoln. The Constitutional Union worked towards the best interest of a unified nation, suggesting John Bell capable of doing so. Unlike the other parties, the Democrats were divided into 2, the North and the South. As a more neutral party, the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas in hopes that he would allow for more rights to the state. The Southern Democrats, concerned over the election's impact to their economy, selected John C. Breckinridge to protect their concerns over slaveholders and the right to own their property. However, as the Democratic group was split, Abraham Lincoln was able to gain most of the free Northeast and Northwestern votes in the Electoral College and 40% of the popular vote, succeeding as the 16th President of the United States of America, and ultimately ending Southern political dominance.
The completed election of 1860 caused unrest as it had ended in favor of the Republicans. Although Abraham Lincoln acknowledged his presidential duties first and chose to merely limit the expansion of slavery, the southern states grew uneasy at the prospect that they could potentially lose their familiar patterns of life. They believed that Lincoln would ultimately support abolitionist ideals and favor northern interests only. This soon escalated into the issuing of South Carolina's Declaration of Causes of Secession. Acting as a catalyst, southern states were goaded to break off from America one by one with the call for political change. The secession and establishment of the Confederate States of America would eventually lead to the Civil War in 1861. After the end of the American Revolution, the United States had adopted its first confederal system. Unfortunately, it proved ineffective as the weak central government could not support the country in times of need. This eventually heightened Shays' Rebellion, America's first civil war in 1786. Despite such failure with the First Confederacy, the southern states still found the idea appealing because theoretically, the federal government would not be able to intervene in personal matters, especially that of slavery. After the disappointing results of the election of 1860, the southern states began seceding from the Union. The movement began with South Carolina and slowly extended to a total of 11 states. This included Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The newly Confederate states shortly secured its own capital in Montgomery, Alabama, later changing it to Richmond, Virginia in May of 1861. They also elected Jefferson Davis as their new president and leader. The Confederate States of America were prepared for the right to handle their affairs. They believed that this form of government could protect their interests and rights better than federalism could. Thus, when President Abraham Lincoln of the Union announced that the South's secession was unacceptable, the Confederacy answered with war.
A few years into the brutal Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln, who had stated that government cannot endure permanently half-slave, half-free, projected into the future and drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. The 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, commonly described as the new birth of freedom, was to be the written order that in a northern and southern unified nation, slavery would be abolished as a whole. Throughout his life, President Abraham Lincoln had strongly viewed the use of slaves for all its immorality. However, certain expectancies of his presidential responsibility had prevented him from taking much action. Unfortunately, the progression of the Civil War came to call for a change. Not only did the Southerners view slavery as oppression, the abolitionist movement was also solidifying in Europe. When Lincoln had first proposed the idea of an Emancipation Proclamation, his suggestions were rejected by his executive cabinet. At the time, the South seemingly had the upper hand in the war, and the cabinet believed that issuing the Emancipation Proclamation then and there would be viewed as a weak and desperate ploy. They had felt that a major Northern victory was necessary to show that the Union's strength would be sufficient in enforcing such a statement. During the Battle of Antietam, on September 17, 1862, the Yankees had driven away the first Confederate attempts at invading the North. Such success had become the key in boosting the Union's own morale and accumulating public support for its cause. The shots fired during this fight had also kept potential Southern allies neutral. Because of this, President Abraham Lincoln found it opportune to start preparations for his Emancipation Proclamation speech. On January 1st of 1863, the authoritative executive order known as the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln. It had decreed that all Confederate states in rebellion had to obey a release clause regarding slaves. Unfortunately, many slaves were still kept in bondage as the statement had only antagonized the South, making compromise seem impossible. However, free and runaway slaves were welcome to enlist in the Union Army to fight for their people's freedom. By the month of October in that year, almost 200,000 African Americans had enlisted in the Army and Navy. The Emancipation Proclamation not only gave slaves hope, but it also pushed the South to fight harder to keep their commonplace lives. The Emancipation Proclamation was the documented end to the use of degrading and harsh slave labor in the United States of America. It had radically changed ideas within the country through its partake in the Civil War, as well as its role in several constitutional amendments that extended human rights to the free African American population today.
After brief success in Virginia, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy led his army to invade the North at Gettysburg, intending to strike the Union while it was vulnerable. The battle at Gettysburg would be considered as one of the most devastating battles fought in the Civil War. It was spread out between a span of 3 days and resulting in over 51,000 casualties from both sides, surpassing that of the total deaths in the Revolutionary War with Britain. As expected from its outrageous statistics, the Battle of Gettysburg became a major deciding factor to the Civil War, as it had crippled the South from ever invading the North again. The bloody fight began on the 1st of July in 1863 on the outskirts of Pennsylvania known as Gettysburg. Initially, A.P. Hill of the Confederate Army had just hoped to restock his soldiers with proper footwear and rendezvous with General Lee. However, his encounter with the Northern armies under General John Buford soon turned into a rebel assault concentrated on engaging the Union Army to destroy it. Winning the battle required overtaking the southern position of the Cemetery Ridge. At the end of the day, however, Hill failed to meet his goals, and little progress was made by either side, as only small groups of soldiers attempted any advancement at a time. On July 2nd, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg took place. 90,000 Yankees were stationed to fight 75,000 Confederate soldiers in a fishhook formation. General James Longstreet of the Confederate Army led troops on a mission to overtake the Union position. He and his men waited for an opportune moment to strike, which came with a few open places on the Little Round Top. They soon managed to orchestrate heavy Union losses. However, Colonel Joshua L. Chamberlain successfully led a repulsion of the rebels after ammunition losses had forced a tactic change to a bayonet charge. On July 3rd, the final day of the battle had occurred on Culp's Hill. General Lee proposed an artillery barrage known as Pickett's Charge to the middle Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. However, lack of communication pushed General Pickett into leading a Confederate group to the Union center, of which the Yankee infantry remained resolute in defending and keeping the high southern grounds. In a desperate attempt to keep the element of surprise, General Lee changed tactics. He ordered General James E. B. Stuart to circle the right flank of Meade's forces. Unfortunately, that too was met with Union resistance led by David Gregg. Ultimately defeated, General Lee left the North in retreat. After General Lee's defeat in the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate Army fell short of food, shoes, uniforms, guns, and ammunition supplies. This loss prevented any future invasions of the North, turning the Civil War in favor of the Union, and ultimately the federal government. 2 years later from the event, Robert E. Lee finally acknowledged that his men were too weak and ill-equipped to fight, surrendering his army to General Grant at the house of Wilmer McLean in the village of Appomattox Courthouse and ending the long, deadly Civil War.